Queen Althea sat in her great hall, surrounded by tall windows of crystal glass. The throne upon which she sat was carved from bright stone, polished until it shone like silver in the light. Her servants and guards moved quietly around her, each step measured so as not to disturb the silence. To the people, she was majestic and strong. To the world, she was the protector of peace. But deep inside her heart, Althea carried a memory that no crown or court could remove. Many years earlier, before she became queen, she had been only a young princess. Back then, she was curious, restless, and often dared to travel where her guards warned her not to go. On one such journey, she had been caught in a disaster. A mining colony in the black of space had collapsed after an explosion, and she had been trapped in its ruined tunnels. Dust had filled her lungs, heat pressed against her skin, and for a moment, she believed she would never escape. But then a man appeared. She remembered it as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. His face was streaked with soot, his uniform torn. He was not a noble, nor a knight of the court, but a common soldier who fought only because duty demanded it. She could still recall the way his eyes looked as he reached out to her. They were steady, clear, and strangely full of calm. He had carried her up through the broken passages, his arms strong enough to push aside rocks, and his will strong enough to keep moving even when both of them stumbled. And then, just as suddenly as he came, he was gone. He had left her with the rescuers once they reached safety and vanished into the chaotic crowd before she could even ask his name. Althea returned to her palace, and her life as a princess continued. Yet that one man never left her thoughts. He was not just another soldier who appeared and disappeared with war. He had felt different. To her, he was a savior who had shown courage without seeking reward. And though years passed and her crown grew heavy, that memory stayed sharp in her heart, like a star refusing to fade in the darkest night. Now as she sat on her throne, the council spoke of political matters and treaties, taxes and armies, but she listened with only half her mind. The other half was remembering. She pictured again the hands that had lifted her from the rubble, the voice telling her not to give up, and the way strength seemed to flow from him, even as the walls crumbled overhead. Her guards thought her silence was regal. The ministers thought her stillness was wisdom. But her quiet gaze across the great hall was not for them. It was shaped by the ghost of that memory. Somewhere among the countless millions of people in her kingdom lived the man who had once saved her life. She did not remember his name, and he had never known hers. To him, she had likely been nobody important at all. That, she realized, was what made his action shine far brighter in her heart. He had helped a stranger simply because it was right. Her palace singers began a quiet song at the edge of the hall, but she hardly listened. She wondered if he was even alive now. Battles had been many, wars had stretched across star systems, and countless men had been lost to the endless struggle. Perhaps he had fallen long ago. Or perhaps he still walked out there living as any other soldier among the crowds, unaware that a queen remembered him each day. Kea clasped her hands together and leaned back in her throne. She had everything, yet she felt a strange emptiness she could not explain to her ministers, or even to her closest companions. They would not understand. For them, a man was only a soldier. For her, he was proof that humanity could shine brightest when no one was watching. The torches flickered as wind pressed softly through the tall windows. The queen did not move. Outside, the kingdom thrived, but inside her heart there was a silence none could break. She had ruled with wisdom. She had commanded armies. She had spoken words that moved millions. Yet when she was alone with her thoughts, there was only one truth she could not escape. She had been saved once, not by a knight with banners, not by a hero the bards would sing about, but by a man who had looked at her as if she was worth saving even when she was nothing more than a stranger in the dust. And though she carried a crown of great power and a voice that ruled worlds, the strongest memory she carried was that moment of human courage. It had shaped her more deeply than all her wealth. In that silence upon her throne, she thought of him again. She wondered what it would mean if she ever crossed paths with him once more. And she wondered, with a quiet ache in her chest, if he would even recognize her. Matthew Hale walked through the great gates of the palace, his boots echoing on the polished floor. He had served as a commander in the fleet for over 10 years, and though battles had hardened his face and sharpened, his voice a piece of him still felt like the young soldier who once carried strangers out of fire and ruin. To him those days were distant memories, tucked away and buried under duty. He never thought they mattered to anyone else. He came to the capital because the queen herself had called for him. The warlords from the outer worlds had begun to rise with sudden strength, taking trade routes and burning ships. Their forces moved with sharp cruelty, and the fleet had been beaten back more than once. The council demanded new answers and new leaders, for the kingdom seemed ready to fall at last. When Matthew entered the great hall, he paused. The air inside was cool, filled with the scent of polished stone and bright fire from tall torches. At the far end, sitting calm and still on her throne, was Queen Althea. She lifted her gaze as he approached, and the silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. She knew him at once, the same steady eyes, the same simple stance. It was the face that had lived in her memory for years. Her heart stilled, her words caught, and for one moment, she forgot her entire court was watching. Matthew bowed, not knowing the weight his arrival placed on her soul. He was only aware of his duty, not of the memory that bound him to her past. To him, she was the ruler of the kingdom, a figure distant and untouchable. To her, he was the man who had once pulled her from death itself. Her voice emerged faintly, trembling not with fear but with strain. She spoke to him as she would to any officer. She asked of the fleet, of the battles fought, of the losses endured, but her eyes would not release him. More than once she fell into silence, unable to frame her words, making the courtiers around whisper that perhaps their queen was weighing great choices in her mighty mind. Inside, though, Althea felt only a quiet storm. This was no myth, no dream, but the man himself. He was human, flesh and blood, and he stood before her with no idea of the bond that tied them. Matthew answered her questions with calm strength. He spoke simply, without grand speeches, saying what needed to be said. He told her of the broken stations along the border, of the men and women who fought without proper support, of desperate measures taken in battles that seemed nearly impossible. His words carried no polish, but their honesty filled the hall with a force that even the most practiced speaker could not create. The ministers shifted in discomfort, for they did not like the truth. They wanted promises, comfort, and easy victories. Matthew gave them none. He only gave facts, and Althea, still drinking in the sight of him after so many years, felt a strange calm settle into her heart. This was the voice of the same man who had told her not to give up as smoke invaded her lungs. This was the strength that had carried her when she had no strength left. When he finished, the hall fell still. The queen rose, her gown trailing across the white floor as she stepped forward. She thanked him calmly, her voice strong, though her chest ached with hidden memory. To all who watched, it was her royal way of acknowledging a commander. To her own heart, however, it was the only way she could keep from breaking into words the world would not understand. That night, when the hall was empty and she sat alone again on her throne, she thought of how her people believed she hesitated because of political reasons. They would laugh if they knew the truth. They would say that their queen, who held armies at her command, had been shaken to silence simply because she saw a man again after all these years. But she knew it was real. She knew her silence was born from awe, from memory, and from the sudden knowledge that the one who had changed her fate was fully human, with no crown, no title, no legend. Just a man with courage enough to save a stranger. As the palace slept, Althea's world quietly shifted. She had seen him again, and nothing, not the council, not the wars, not the weight of kingdoms, could ever erase that truth. The warlords attacked with fire and fury. Their red banners spread across the skies as their fleets cut through the stars. One city after another cried for help. Villages burned, towers crumbled, and every cry reached the throne of Queen Althea. Her people looked to her for strength, but for the first time in many years, danger felt closer than ever before. The council argued inside the walls of the palace. Old men shouted about treaties, others begged for more soldiers, some even suggested surrender. The noise of their words filled the great chamber like the clash of swords. But in the middle of the storm, Commander Matthew Hale stood as still as stone. His steady eyes did not waver, and his words cut through the noise when he finally spoke. "We cannot defend every wall," he said calmly. "If we try to protect everything, we will lose everything. We must draw them in, let them think we are weak, and then strike with a power they do not expect." The The council grew restless. They did not like risk. They did not like bold plans. They wanted safety in the known. Yet Matthew's plan was clear. Above the skies, floating among the stars, were thousands of silent satellites. For years they had drifted unused, old machines left behind. Matthew spoke of turning them into weapons to light the heavens with fire in one great trap. The counselors shouted again. They called it foolish, reckless, unworthy of a kingdom that valued order. But Queen Althea remained silent, as she had listened to their fear long enough. She lifted her hand, and the hall went quiet. Her voice was clear. "We will follow the plan of Commander Hale." Her words broke through the doubt like sunlight pierces the fog. Counselors bowed their heads, some unwillingly, but they could not rise against her will. And as she spoke those words, her heart lifted. She remembered again the miner's rubble, the smoke, the darkness, and the man who had carried her. Then, as now, he had chosen to act when others froze. Matthew bowed his head with respect, but in his chest burned a fire of determination. Now he carried not only the hope of soldiers, but the trust of his queen. Within days, the fleet moved with secret silence. Ships were sent to repair the broken satellites, each one hidden from enemy eyes. The people whispered of strange movements in the sky, but did not know their meaning. To the enemy, it looked like weakness, like confusion. To the kingdom, it was quiet preparation for something greater. When the enemy fleets came, they came with all their might. Red fire lit the night skies above the outer cities. Screams rose from the coast, where ships crashed into harbors. The people trembled as each hour brought news of new ruins. It seemed the kingdom could not last more than a day longer. But Matthew was calm. He ordered his ships to retreat slowly, step by step, layer by layer. The enemy believed victory was near. It gave chase into the orbit of the kingdom, closer and closer, until the satellites above them glowed to life. The skies turned white with sudden light. The old machines awoke like 1,000 suns, streams of energy bursting across space. Hundreds of enemy ships were struck in a single moment. Fire spread through their ranks. Screams of confusion filled their comms as Matthew commanded his fleet forward into the chaos. The people of the capital lifted their eyes and saw the heavens shine. Children shouted in the streets, elders knelt to the ground in prayer, and soldiers cried with pride. For they had seen the power of courage at last. Back in the palace, Queen Althea stood at her high window and saw the trap unfold. Around her, courtiers spoke in awe. But she did not speak. She knew this brilliance came not from tradition, not from books of strategy, not from cold counsel, but from a human mind willing to dare, willing to risk, willing to fight with heart. And once again she thought of the moment long ago, when he had lifted her from destruction. It was the same strength, only now on a greater scale. Then it had been the life of one girl. Now it was the life of a whole kingdom. The bond grew stronger in her heart, though she told no one. As night fell, the enemy retreated in broken pieces, their fleets shattered. Yet the war was far from over. The kingdom was alive, but battles still waited. And so, in the quiet after fire, Queen Althea sat alone with her thoughts. Her people believed they were saved by their queen. She knew the truth. They had been saved by one man who carried the power of humanity inside him. The war dragged on through many weeks. The trap in the skies had broken the enemy fleet, yet fragments of their power remained. They regrouped in the shadows and struck without warning, hoping to scare the kingdom into weakness. Villages near the borders burned, supply ships were hunted, and soldiers grew weary. Hope was rising in the hearts of the people, but fear never left them completely. Queen Althea spent her days in her throne room and her nights in her private chamber, always surrounded by advisors who argued over choices. Yet her mind continued to return to Commander Matthew Hale. He had brought them victory where none believed it possible. She began to trust him more than her council, more than her generals, even more than herself. His courage and calm felt like a shield around her heart. One evening, as the stars glowed pale over the palace, she asked him to meet her in the observatory at the highest tower. He entered the vast room quietly, his boots steady against the marble floor. The glass walls opened to the wide darkness of space, where the shattered ruins of the enemy still drifted like ash. For a long moment, she did not speak. She stood beside the window, her gown long and flowing, lit by the faint glow of the stars. He remained behind her, waiting with patience. Finally, she turned and faced him. "Tell me," she said softly, her voice without the weight of a queen, but simply as a woman who wished for truth, "why do you fight as you do?" Her question surprised him. It expected commands about the next maneuver, news about supplies, perhaps even arguments about the next battle. But she asked something deeper. Matthew did not rush his words, spoke as if he were speaking only to himself, because it is what must be done. "On the day of the mining collapse, I saw people buried in rock and fire. I carried out as many as I could. That was not because of rank or duty, but because they were alive. When a person is alive, it means they are worth saving." His words struck her deeper than any speech she had heard in all her years as queen. They were simple words, spoken without elegance, yet they were heavy with truth. She felt her chest tighten, her heart full. For so many years she had wondered why he had pulled her from that ruin. She once imagined it was because he had known she was of royal blood. She once thought it was fate or mystery. But standing here looking at his calm face, she understood. He had not saved her because she was special. He had saved her because she was human. Silence filled the chamber. The stars beyond the glass moved slowly, gliding across the sky. She wished she could tell him what he meant to her, that the memory of his arms lifting her had guided her every choice as queen. But she did not. She could not. A queen was meant to carry her feelings in silence. Still, her eyes lingered on him longer than they should have. He shifted slightly under her gaze, but showed no sign of discomfort. He was used to long silences, used to letting them fill the air like companions. At last he bowed his head. "Your Majesty, tomorrow the enemy will strike again on the northern front. We must be ready." "I will move with the fleet as you command." She nodded, though her chest ached at the thought of him in battle. She wanted to tell him to stay safe, to guard his life for himself as much as for her. Instead, she only said, "Then lead them with the same strength you showed me long ago." His eyes flickered with curiosity. But before he could ask what she meant, she turned back toward the stars. When he left, the chamber grew quiet again. Althea pressed her hands against the glass and watched the wide blackness of the universe stretch beyond her world. She thought of all the crowns and thrones that had existed before her. None of them mattered at this moment. What mattered was the quiet understanding that greatness came not from her station, not from her bloodline, but from the humanity of one man who never cared for reward. In that moment she loved him, though she spoke it to no one. It was not the love of ballads sung in halls, filled with flowers and vows. It was the kind of love that grew out of deep respect, born of truth and courage. It was a silent bond that would never leave her, no matter how many battles remained. And as the stars burned outside the glass, Queen Althea felt certain that even in the darkest night, it was the light of such humanity that would guide her kingdom forward. The final battle came with a fire greater than anything the kingdom had known. The sky shook with roaring engines. The ground trembled as fleets clashed above, their lights cutting paths across the heavens. People in villages and cities gathered outside their homes, lifting their eyes to watch their fate unfold in burning streaks over their world. At the center of it all was Commander Matthew Hale, leading the fleet with steady orders and calm voice. His soldiers followed him not because of fear, not only because of duty, but because his courage never wavered. When the sky seemed ready to break, his words held them like strong hands in the storm. On the ground, Queen Althea remained in the palace, her gaze locked on the wide sky through the highest window. Courtiers rushed in panic, messengers ran with news of losses and victories, but her heart could only think of one man. She listened for every update, every signal from the fleet, her hands tightening each time a messenger ran into the hall. The hours stretched like whole days. Waves of fire came and went, enemy ships trying again and again to break past Matthew's trap, but each time he turned their speed against them, leading them into empty orbits, cutting their lines, striking where they were weakest. Finally, when the last red light of the enemy broke apart in the sky, the people in the streets lifted their voices in cheer. Bells rang in every city. Soldiers shouted with triumph. The warlords who had come to burn the kingdom were gone, and only silence and smoke remained. The war was over. The people raised their queen in their voices. They believed her wisdom had brought the victory. Songs were sung in her name before the night was even finished. But Althea knew the songs should have been for Matthew. Without him, the kingdom would have been darkness. Later, In the great hall, she stood before her court. Torches burned bright. The cheers from outside came through the windows like a great river of sound. At her side stood Matthew, his uniform torn, his face marked with smoke and long days without rest, yet his eyes steady as always. She lifted her hand, and the voices fell silent. She spoke not of herself, but of humanity. She declared that crowns and councils could not alone keep a world alive. She said the kingdom had been saved by courage, by will, by the strength of those who dared without asking reward. She spoke of the spirit inside people that made them rise from dust and turn weakness into fire. And as she spoke, her eyes rested on Matthew, so that even though she never named him, everyone saw the truth in her gaze. The hall erupted in thunderous cheers. People clapped and bowed, their voices shaking the stone walls with joy. Yet Matthew, standing behind her, held no pride in his face. He only looked forward quietly, as if victory was nothing but the end of one task, the duty of any soldier. When the night came and the halls grew empty, Althea walked alone on the terrace above the palace. The air was soft, carrying the faint smell of smoke mixed with sea wind from the coast. She looked over her kingdom as firelights from the people's celebrations filled the land like stars on the ground. Matthew joined her there, standing a short distance away. For a time, they both said nothing. The silence between them was filled with years of memory. She finally turned to him, her crown catching the moonlight. "You once saved me when I was just a girl," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Matthew frowned in thought, but then the memory returned to him. The rubble, the smoke, the broken miners' colony. His eyes widened slightly. "It was you," he whispered. She nodded, her heart shaking but her face calm. "I never forgot. That day taught me that true greatness comes not from titles, but from the heart of those who dare to act." Matthew bowed his head, not knowing what to say. Words seemed too small for such a moment. Althea stepped closer, her voice as soft as the night air. "To the world you are a commander. To me you are the reason I found the strength to be more than a queen." The silence stretched again, but it was no longer heavy. It was gentle, quiet, a bond spoken without more words. Above them, the sky was clear, washed clean of battle, shining with millions of stars. That night, as celebrations carried on far below, Queen Althea stood beside Matthew on the terrace. She allowed herself, for once, to be at peace. She did not need to speak, because the truth was clear in her heart. The man who had once lifted her out of the dust had lifted a whole kingdom, and though songs would sing of her rule, she knew her strength would always be tied to the courage of the man who would always remain entirely and profoundly human.